Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
And welcome to the final reading for the Fall 2022 Visiting Writers Series here at Brevard College. I would like to thank the Humanities Division and West Lecture Series funds, which make this reading series possible. Our reading this evening will be in round robin style, beginning with our visiting poet Marybeth Holleman, then myself, as we engage in dialogue about the natural world through our poetry. We will then set aside time for questions. Please use the provided microphone to ask questions when the time comes. Now, I am delighted to introduce our visiting poet Marybeth Holleman, who is visiting us from Alaska, although she was raised right here in the mountains of Western North Carolina. Last week, my creative writing students read her poem, Skating After Many Moons. First, they were delighted by the poem's initial mention of the Alaskan wood frog and accompanying illustration. Our conversation then turned to Holleman's use of dizzying syntax and punctuation to slip between time, from the speaker recording the frog's chorus with her son to recalling how to ice skate when the son is now grown. Holleman's lyrical intensity is evident in her most recent poetry collection, Tender Gravity, available over there from Highland Books, a poignant meditation on the environment and place amidst incalculable loss. So please join me in welcoming Marybeth Holleman, who will begin the reading with her poem, then I'll read a poem, and we'll take it from there. So thank you so much for being here. Marybeth Holleman.
Thanks everyone for being here on this gorgeous day. I mean, when it's beautiful weather like this, you think, is anyone going to come inside and listen to poetry? I gave a reading in August in Kodiak, Alaska, which is known for its rain, and they had had rain for, 20 days, and then the day I was supposed to read, it was sunny. So, thank you. I also want to thank Dr. Alyse Bensel for inviting me, and Brevard College for having me here, and I want to give special thanks to Wanda Moser, alumna of Brevard College and most amazing mother-in-law and grandmother to my son, who has been an incredible supporter of my writing through all these years. So appreciate you. So my book, Tender Gravity, I'm just going to go ahead and jump in and read a poem. And I think I'm going to just throw you right into Alaska right away. So I've lived in Alaska for 35 years, and I moved there actually just for the summer jobs. A lot of people do that in Alaska. And I got a chance to go out in a kayak in Prince William Sound that first summer. And I'd always lived in, I grew up in Asheville, but I always loved the coast. And I was always looking for this place where the mountains and the coast were together. And I saw Prince William Sound and it was like, yes, like this is my place. The other amazing thing about Prince William Sound is all the glaciers, all the tidewater glaciers that come down to the sea. But over the last 35 years, my glaciers have been leaving. So glaciers that I've known for quite some time are just receding, thinning. So this is a poem about that. Oh, and then I also want to say a lot of my poems have to do with this sort of sense of loss. And when I think about eco-anxiety or climate grief, so many terms out there about it, I remember this quote by the poet Rumi, who said, "The remedy for the pain is in the pain." How to grieve a glacier. It's not something you can hold in your arms. You can't rock with its image in a blanket and keen away the nearing pain. That white face is distant and cold, unrelenting in its forward grind to the sea. Stalwart, even as it thins, crumbles, pulls back into history and oblivion. The sun itself finds nothing to love, save soft rivulets of water, its rays released from eons of hard frozen luck. But I tell you, I do love this blue-white giant and grieve its leaving, even as I thrill to watch thunderbolts of ice crash into azure seas. So we sit, you and I, scanning the newly revealed and imagining what next will show itself, what balded rock and bared shoreline, as ice slips and pools away in great chunks. We know it is leaving, abandoning us to what our kind has created, and we know its gift of rarefied water will only bring more sorrow. Yet, it is a gorgeous deterioration, glowing face of one turned toward what the living cannot see.
Thank you, Marybeth. That is, I think, a beautiful demonstration of your work and that sense of loss that I see tracing throughout, and also the wonderful use of syntax that you have and how these sentences spiral and move throughout your poetry. So I'm going to read a response poem. What we're going to do, and the first time I ever saw this done was in, I think, 2017, and it was with the now Poet Laureate of the United States, Ada Limon, herself, and two other poets did a round robin style reading, and it stood out to me because I loved the resonances within their work and also how different they were. So I'm going to read from my debut poetry collection, Rare Wondrous Things, which is a biography and poems of German naturalist Maria Sibylla Merian, who was a 17th and early 18th century naturalist. And I'm going to start at the beginning. And also today is Indigenous Peoples Day, and that also was on my mind. And this poem is about the illustrator Theodore de Bry, who did these fantastical depictions of colonization in the New World. And we know that from a young age, Marian was looking at these. She came from a family of artisans and artists, and so I was imagining her looking at these plates that are so beautiful and yet depict so much violence. Inheriting Theodore de Bry's History Americae. She's seen the idealized native, a victim made classical myth without witness. An homage to monsters that dwell within monsters. The Spaniards find easy passage by fashioning chariots from turtles and lions. Nereids bathe close to the ship. A soldier holds a lily in wonder, inhales its salty fragrance. The natives must know if these arrivals are lesser gods who breathe water. Punishment is given freely. No one is spared. The waves take all. They offer gold as gifts, then pour it molten down foreign throats. Melting flesh muffles their screams. Columbus alone, John Smith alone. These men are insistent on the knowledge land is theirs. This primer on violence for a girl who is shown fish fly, and the naked and clothed alike are hanged. She mourns and delights in such wicked perishing, yet there is want for departure.
Thanks, Alyse. That's just such a beautiful and complex poem. And one of the things I love about your book is the complexity of the subject matter and how you bring together so many things about science and being a woman and colonization and how we treat and look at the non-human world. So let's see. I'm going to read one. It's about a moss called sphagnum, and I'm choosing that because one of the places where I find solace in this changing world, in all the loss that we're experiencing, is in all that we don't know. And Alyse's book speaks to so much of how people were searching to understand certain beings that we share this planet with in so many different ways that we were doing that. And there's so much we still don't know. It just boggles my mind. just a little example, and that is we had a lot of rain in August, and I was walking the dogs down our street, which is paved, and there were all these worms out on the road. I'm sure you guys have seen this when there's a lot of rain. So I'm picking them up and putting them over on the soil because I don't want to get them squished and I don't want them to dry out. So then I went home and I started Googling around, like, why do worms do that? Like, why do they come out of the soil and travel around on pavement? And the theory, at least when I was, for many years, what I thought it was is because we were told that they might drown if the water was too saturated. And yet now scientists are thinking, no, that's not it. That they're just using this ground saturated time to migrate and find mates. So anyhow, it was just like one of those moments where it's like, we still don't know why worms are doing that, So there's so much we don't know. But anyhow, this moss, sphagnum, grows in Alaska, and because we have so much rain, it's very happy there. And it can pull water up from way below the surface, and so it pulls water up for all the other plants too. And it can hold 40 times its weight in water, so absorbent that the Alutiiq people who inhabit the Aleutian Islands, Kodiak Archipelago, that part of Alaska, used it as diapers. So, sphagnum. Imagine being able to pull water from deep below to the surface where you live. Imagine being able to hold 40 times your weight of that which you most require. What if it were love? What if you could hold 40 times your weight in love? And what if, in that holding, you expanded, buoyant and strong, and more yourself?
Ooh, I love a great poem about moss, also one of my favorite plants. I'm co-teaching a class with a colleague in biology, and we are focusing on talking about plants from a literary and scientific perspectives, and I just love how all of those things are combining in that poem and in your work, so thank you for sharing. I'm going to kind of go off of the themes that you mentioned earlier in the observations about my work, about this pursuit of knowledge, and thinking about it in terms of time and patience, and still not quite being able to get an answer, despite all of that pursuit. So Maria Sibylla Merian was a well-known, as I said, naturalist and illustrator, and she became very well known for depicting metamorphosis at a time when insect metamorphosis was still a controversial idea. It was being proven piecemeal. So some things were thought to metamorphosize, other things weren't. The invention of the microscope helped with that, but we were still in kind of rudimentary stages with magnification. And she kept a lot of moths and butterflies in her house, and caterpillars and cocoons. And one of these moths she kept for 12 years, and it never, she raised it and it went into a cocoon and never emerged, and she could never quite fully depict its metamorphosis in that cycle. So this poem is about that waiting. 12 years for Hylas euphorbiae, and the epigraph from Maria Sibylla Merian reads, one of the longest but most pleasant transformations. Maria Sibylla Merian on the spurge hawk moth. I learn patience through counting uncertainty. Record an afternoon's descent into idleness as cells rearrange for flight, the hawk moth's silent ecstasy. Every iteration has potential to stretch and harden, reach full wingspan, instead of lolling stunted with a body unable to lift into late spring air. Purged of parasites and imperfections, the pupa, healing itself from infection, waits. No one can guard its exterior. 10 years I have failed. I will fail again for this beauty.
I love that last line. I will fail again for this beauty. The power of beauty in our lives, and recognizing it, taking the time to actually pay attention. is such an incredible thing. I'm gonna go with this theme of time, 12 years. A lot of the poems, there's a significant number of poems in my book that have to do with geology. Because another place that I find solace is in time, in the expansiveness of time, and how minuscule our time on Earth is. And I'm not even just talking about individual lives, but of course all of humanity. And I find some solace in that, knowing that it was around long before we came along, and being here in the mountains where I grew up and thinking of these old mountains and how long these mountains have been here. And I live in Alaska where the mountains, they're newer, they're sharp and jagged and rocky, and nothing grows on their peaks, and they're still icy. And so anyhow, I'm going to read one of my rock poems. If I can find it. It's called Every Rock. Every rock remembers the day I was born, remembers the afternoon you learned to walk. Not even the slightest wing beat of a moth, as sunlight lifts early morning dew, escapes their notice. They witness and regard all life with the tenderness of a grandparent gazing on the new. Eyes that see far beyond anything words could convey, and yet yearn, regardless, for the happiness of the child. I know this is so, but I don't know what rocks make of it. My life, yours, they seem content with how we've turned out. But when asked if we're doing what we were put here for, they're silent. I press both palms hard against their solid coolness, and all they say is, do not think too much of your life. Then, like an echo off granite cliffs once covered in ice, I hear, do not think too much of all life. It is a sweet interlude in the turbulence. We will be missed.
Those resonances with thinking about time and scale are so powerful in that poem, and just thinking about human lifespan and human memory against geologic time, and how those structures stand as witness, even if they're not talking to us in a way hopefully we're starting to understand, especially with glacial melt, but sometimes that takes a long time to understand. So I was thinking about understanding and time again, and I'm going to kind of shift a little bit in thinking about understanding, the ideas of understanding and maybe not understanding with Maria Sibylla Marion's life. So besides being a prolific artist and scientist, she was married and had a family, and then had to do all of those housewife duties. And her marriage did fall apart. She was one of the few people who just decided, her and her husband divorced at a time when that was not a thing. And the way she continued to have a business on her own and be successful was she claimed he was dead. Meanwhile, he remarried and had a family separate from her. So she was highly independent in that way, and a very astute businesswoman at a time when there were lots of restrictions on what she could and could not do. And so this poem is a persona poem from the perspective of Marion, thinking about her husband. Engraved in copper and published herself. My husband always stayed close to drink, red-faced, with a smile loose like unspooled thread on the table set aside for me as a girl, scattered with embroidery and watercolors. I skirted the law. My stepfather agreed to let me watch his apprentices work coating copper plates with wax, taking up feathers to copy design while they mixed inks smelling of earth and crushed shells. The machinery radiated elemental heat. My mother made me scrub my ink-stained hands until they reddened raw, palms cracked. I had the precision of smaller hands. I accrued skill until I could be set to marry a man who watched my talents grow, who needed a better family name. He became my printing press, the source of copper and care to wipe the ink, perfect the line. I measured the cut into metal, a relief bit into wax design. The ink settled into miniature valleys made with needlepoint, an embroidery for what lasts longer than velvet. I washed away the excess. I had been left so little. He gained.
Thanks. The weaving of the personal life of this woman and her work, especially at that time in history, is really powerful. And I thought, since reading your book, about the power of using poetry to almost reimagine a person's life. And I've seen this done with some other, women artists and scientists that were working at a time when working in those fields as a woman was very uncommon. So it's very powerful. I'm gonna slip into my Skating After Many Moons poem, I think, because that's a mama poem. So let's see. I grew up in Asheville, Beaver Lake in Asheville, if any of y'all know Asheville. I know Peggy does. When we were kids, every now and then it would freeze. And so I'm one of 6 kids. And so as you can imagine, they tried to get us out of the house every so often. And so Dad would take us down there and we'd skate. But I never really, learned. It was just like a handful of times in my childhood. But the other thing I want to say about this is, well, 2 things. One is, growing up, all these snakes and lizards and salamanders and turtles. In Alaska, we have one cold-blooded animal, and that's a wood frog, which I just learned is at its southernmost range here, which is amazing to me, that this little frog could live here and in Alaska. And then the last thing I want to say about this poem is that I think about how memory is rooted not just in our minds and in our photographs, but also in place. So there are places that I go to that a flood of memories come back that I may not have even remembered that I had remembered until I got to that place. So those many things, and now the poem. Skating After Many Moons. It's a small lake, a pond really, or not even that. A wet meadow in summer, where our one kind of frog, who contains some kind of antifreeze in its veins, lives. The only one can survive this far north, our only amphibian, only cold-blooded being. And when he was young, my boy, and I wanted to keep him awake to the world, we came here and listened to the frog chorus, recorded it for a scientist cataloging the city's frogs, who wanted to see how changing weather was changing them. Would there be more or less? Would they die out as summers dried? She gave us a recording so we'd know what to listen for, but there was no mistaking the tender, high notes, held and overlapping, like the rounds I sang at summer camp, calls unlike the looping lilt of birds. Now, when I stand on this frozen meadow, in white figure skates I got when I was just a girl, still in easy love with this world, I hear all that's held under ice since we recorded the frog chorus. My boy grown to a man who may or may not notice the frogs are leaving. When I stand here seeking the certainty a child feels about the world that holds her steady, a mother feels for her boy holding her hand as they cross the damp meadow and stand still, listening. When I move clumsily, cautiously, afraid of reeling headfirst onto what might crack, my limbs begin to remember from my girlhood the few times the lake froze and my dad took all us kids there, swung us around, and that one time I skated with a friend who flew circles and arcs around my leaden feet. My limbs fling it all and swing me around and around until I am dizzy in love again, until the world is aright and all this keeps me twirling.
Thank you so much for reading that poem. My creative writing students who are here, hopefully it's always such a pleasure to be able to hear the work read aloud by the writer and how they perform it. And for those, if you don't have the poem in front of you, I think it's two very long sentences, or just a few, and the syntax is just wonderful and exquisite. And I love some good syntax in a poem and breaking down. I'm a grammar person too, so just being able to unpack all of that and how it moves in these really beautiful ways between setting and time is really lovely. So for this poem, there are a few poems. When I was writing this book, it was initially my dissertation. And when my advisor read through a first draft of the manuscript, she said, "Well, what about you?" And I said, "Well, what about me?" And she said, "Maybe you need to be in this book," because in early drafts, this book was all persona poems, which of course you're still in there a little bit, but I was really trying to distance myself, do something a little more precise in the work. It was very closely chronologically organized at first and had lots of other little details. And I started to back away from that because with Maria Sibylla Merian, we have these beautiful folios that she did of her work and illustrations, and we have these wonderful writing she has about the scientific observations, but we only have about half a dozen to a dozen letters that she wrote, personal letters. We don't have a lot of insight into who she was as a person. And so I started to just think about that kind of lack of evidence and how this manuscript was trying to build up some evidence and reimagine her and give her voice. And I decided it was important to be part of that as well. And earlier in the book, there is a poem called Domestic. And this is a follow-up poem for that called 21st Century Domestic. 21st Century Domestic. Radish leaves soaked under the faucet sprout squirming children that grow into sphinx moths or yellow paper whites littering the kitchen floor. She must tiptoe around their sleeping bodies and feed them drops of sugar water off her index finger. The click of the oven sends them into a fury, so she adapts a raw diet, eats only kale, leaves out her oldest books for them to feast on, until the day she opens the closet to find the wedding dress eaten whole, the moths drunk with silk, satiated and ready to depart these crumbling walls.
The power of individual words in poetry cannot be overstated. Anyone that's read poetry realizes that one of the beauties of it is that it's so condensed. Like a poetry book is so much skinnier than which means that you can buy more poetry and put them on the same shelf. But one of the reasons that I turned to poetry in my previous books or prose is that poetry has this ability to address the ineffable, because you break apart. You don't need to use sentences. You can use punctuation however you want. And you can go wherever you want with it. You don't have to have this storyline narrative. You don't have to make sense. You can just feel it as if it's a piece of abstract art that's untitled, where the painter gives you no clues. You just stand in front of it and let it absorb whatever it is it has to offer you. And so that's why I just have really fallen in love with writing poetry as well, because as I reach out and I try to think about what I want to say, it's not really what I want to say. It's what all these other beings want to say that we're trying to, at least some of us are trying to understand, because we're all on this planet together, we gotta all live together, or it's not gonna happen. And so I spend a lot of time in the more than human world just kind of hanging out and listening, which is why with my rock poem, I'm trying to be a conduit for stones. But I'm going to read this other one. It's called Fortuitous, and it's in the current issue of Orion, which I'm really happy about. For a while, we have birch trees. We have birch trees here too, but we don't have very many deciduous trees, but we have birch trees. For a while, I was collecting birch bark and bringing it home, like this one. It's just a piece of birch bark that I found on the beach. And sometimes, of course, when you bring something home from the woods, it might have something living on it, so you have to take care. And this piece of birch bark had some moss and stuff on it, so I just left it in the yard and just observed it for a while and then put it back. And this is some of the gifts of paying attention and the deep listening that comes, I think, from paying attention to very small, seemingly insignificant things, the way Maria, Sibyl, and Marian did, paying attention to these small beings that have so much to offer to us. Fortuitous. Stop telling me it's nothing, this that has fallen from a tree, a shedding of old skin. Just stop the worn saw of your life's own emptiness. Each morning you wake and breathe. What a miracle. Your lungs and heart working all night long. The blood pulses in your veins. The leaf unfurls and patters summer's shining tune, then falls in a kind of graceful undoing you see as an end, foreboding settling in like the darkest woods. But I ask you to stop excavating for some meaning beyond this piece of birch bark, with the staccato of baby skin sounding dark mouths, tender hands of lichen holding it in standing ovation, a thin green spire housing the red mouth of the inchworm, who emerges only when you fall still and silent. All of it, I tell you, every single hand and mouth, wants to speak to you, yes, to you, right now, in the language of the world.
Such a high impact piece, and I love that forceful ending of just wanting to speak, and the immediacy of it. There's an urgency there. And I'm just thinking now, I edit for a literary journal, and one of our criteria in poetry is the sense of urgency, right? That something has to happen, and that just felt so urgent and important there, so thank you. So this will be my last poem, and then we'll end with Marybeth, and then open it up for questions. And I'm going to kind of come back to that paying close attention to things. And so this poem has to do, it takes a line from Maria Sibylla Marian's study book. So we do have her fragments of her study book where she had her observational notes. Once again, these were fairly objective. We get a little bit of insight, a little bit of subjectivity in her notes and a few asides here. But once again, just very brief glimpses. And this poem was originally written as a villanelle, which is a very fun French form. And I tell my students, I'm like, once you have those 2 lines done, you got a third of the poem done, and you're good to go. And then just like the bird that Marian is observing, the villanelle form started to break down. So it has little vestiges of the villanelle form. So you'll notice some repetitions, some different kind of textures in there, but it kind of broke down as the poem was revised. And so this poem is called Notes on What Comes from Dead Birds. White worms originating from decaying matter. Maria Sibylla Marian, study book. I kept the dead field fair because it pulsated from within, its small heart inflating. I opened its plumage and skin to see white worms in place of a heart, intestines. I kept the bird in a wire cage, and its body writhed as if a hand had ripped away its small heart. From within, an inflation cleaved flesh from bone. For over a fortnight, its body was eaten away. Feathers were all that remained. From within, its small heart inflated and burst. The worm shriveled and dried. I kept watch. Where has its life gone but to the single fly that emerged?
Thank you. It's really a pleasure to read with you. Really fun to do it this way, instead of just one person standing up, going back and forth. It's lovely. I'm going to end with a poem that I'm reading for Wanda, who her parents were farmers. She's always been a gardener. My grandparents were farmers. My parents were gardeners. There's a lot of soil under our nails and our families. And so this is a gardening poem. But a couple other things about it. One is that it speaks to this question that they say all writing is trying to answer this one question, which is, how shall we live? And so I spent a lot of time trying to answer that question. And then the other thing I want to say about this is I mentioned a theologian, his name is Thomas Berry, and he was born and lived in Greensboro, North Carolina. And I think he started out as a Catholic priest, and he studied religions of all over the world, especially Asian religions. And then he started studying geology, and he started studying the earth scientists, and he started calling himself a geologian near the end of his life, and wrote many incredible books, one called The Great Work. It's been a real inspiration to me. In the garden, early May. Oh, one more thing. Because you're in North Carolina. So gardening in Alaska, like the snow melts and you have to go. Because you have like end of May until September to grow stuff. Now we have a lot of daylight, but it's manic. It's so different here. And what you grow here in the spring and fall is what we grow there in our little summer. So, in the garden, early May. I mean to sit and write, but outside my window, the birch that drapes the drive unfurls bright green, and troilus and geraniums push pale heads from soil still damp from snowmelt, and spruce, so dark and brooding all winter, like tiny fires at every tousled tip, and I can't stand to simply watch. Who is to say how a day is best spent? At the end of a life, what remains? A few scattered pages, some of them read, maybe one bright phrase that clings to the world immortal. Like the seeds of birch, so many and small, yet each may grow into a tree taller than a library and is useful. My life is lived like this, choosing whether to record or experience, knowing one without the other lacks meaning, and yet wondering whether meaning is overrated. Believing Thomas Berry right to say, the purpose of life is existence, and self-delight in existence. I apologize to the God of words, but the God of dirt calls to me now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marybeth. It has been such a pleasure to read with you as well. I have 1,000 questions I could ask all day, but I wanted to open up questions to the audience. So if you're interested in asking a question, I will come around with a microphone so you can ask it here. So I will give a few meaningful pauses and do some meaningful eye contact, especially with some of my students. See if folks have questions. Questions.
I do have one question.
Yeah, easy.
So the mountain range, oh, okay. So, if I may ask, the mountain range that you specified was next to the sea. May I ask which place that was again, and which was next to the coast? It was in Alaska, right? I think his name, I can't remember his name, William something point,
Prince William Sound.
Prince William Sound.
Yes, and it's the Chugach Mountain Range that encircles the sound. If you look at a map of Alaska, there's like let's see, this is Alaska, this is southeast, this is the Aleutians, this is all the interior, North Slope up here, it's right in here.
I see it.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I've seen that on Google Maps. It looks really nice there. It's I've been to places like that. I went to San Francisco back in 2012. It was rather like that there, mountainous and also right by the sea.
Yeah, thank you, yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's kind of funny, when I was growing up as a little kid, we had a World Book Encyclopedia. I mean, those of you who are younger don't know what I'm talking about, and I would just sit on the floor in the living room and just flip through the pages, and I found Argentina, because in Argentina the mountains drop to the sea, and so I was going to move to Argentina. I don't know how I missed Alaska. It's the same book.
There's, I think Peru and Chile are like that as well.
Yeah, there are many places, but yes, Prince William Sound was the name of the place. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you, Evie.
Absolutely.
I actually came here because Marybeth and I grew up together, went to high school together. But it has been such a wonderful surprise. I am not a student, so I'm not here because I have to be. But I tell you what, it was, both of you have such interesting styles, and by hearing you read what you had written, it just was so moving, so incredible. And you know, I know that probably to be able to write a book like this, Marybeth, you probably come through many, many years, many changes, much growth, and it's just so, I really am looking forward to getting a chance to read the book and the poetry. And I would not normally buy poetry, but I am really digging this. This is good. Thank you.
Thank you. Poets will take compliments any day of the week, so
My
thank
mouth
you
is
for
loud
coming.
enough. I think it's loud enough. You guys hear me? My question is for you first.
Okay.
So tell me, if I'm not mistaken, did you have an undergraduate specialization in
Environmental studies.
Okay, environmental studies. So did you come to, and what was her name?
Brea Sabila Marian.
Okay, did you come to her through that particular study, or how did you come to this particular sciences?
Thank you, Yuzi. That's an excellent question. And the short answer is I was studying abroad my sophomore year of undergrad, and I traveled to Amsterdam, where I was just goofing off, having a good time, going to all the museums. And I decided one day to go to the Rembrandt Museum, and they were doing a special exhibition of her work. This was 2008, and this is when a lot of the scholarship in English about her work was coming out. There's been a lot of work in German and Dutch up until that point.
Okay.
In fact, her portrait was on one of the marks as well, like on German currency for a while. So she was pretty well known there. And I just became obsessed with the art. I just stared and stared at it. I didn't really care about the Rembrandts, honestly. I was like, this is more interesting. And I also thought it was very modern. I thought this is probably 20th century, and I look and they're like, no, this is 17th century. I was like, oh, okay, it's highly detailed, beautifully ornate. She was a miniaturist, really focused on detail, a lot of precision in the work. And so I wrote down her name and then probably forgot about it for a few years until my MFA, where I started to pick up an interest. And then when I was at the University of Kansas, one of her Insectorum Surinantium folios was available in the archive there. So I went back to it, and it's huge. It's wonderful if you ever get to play around with that 17th and 18th century folios. They're so much fun. And so she became the topic of the dissertation because I knew I wanted something that was going to pair together my interest in literature and art and science, because if I could have, I would have majored in everything in undergrad. And I love research. So this was like a very heavily research involved. I had to read a lot of work, and I absolutely adored that. And I became fascinated with her too, because there's now been a substantial amount of research on her. There's actually been a prose biography of her by Kim Todd, who is a fantastic scholar on women's history specifically. and some also great critiques of her too. I mean, I didn't get to read the poem, but I have one really critiquing her involvement in colonial enterprise in Suriname, because she did travel there later on in life in her 50s. And so that did her masterpiece kind of there, but yet at what cost, you know, what she obviously had some benefits and advantages there. But yeah, so that's how it came to be. It was about a 10-year process from start to finish, 2008, and then I finished in 2018, and then it became a real book in 2020. So not bad for poetry, I think, the timeline. But yeah, that's how it came to be.
I had one other one for our other poet here. So I visited Alaska many moons ago, back in the early 90s. And that was my first time ever visiting Alaska. I haven't been back, but I do recall how absolutely monstrously beautiful Alaska was, because we were there for an athletic tournament, right? And we had very little time to sightsee, but we did get to do some. So I saw the Seward Glacier. We were in Anchorage, but we were also able to see the mountains, and I was just in awe of that place. And the fact that you were able to write about this and beautifully, I must say, eloquently, as Alyse mentioned, it just makes me want to go back to my photos, because I took a lot of photos. And back then, I didn't consider myself a photographer, but I love taking pictures. So I have a lot of snapshots of Alaska. But your poetry has made me want to go back to that, because it just reminded me again of just how gorgeous Alaska is. And and images don't really do it justice, but your poetry has done it justice, and it has encouraged me to go back and look at my images to see if I could even come close to understanding just how gorgeous it is in those images, because your poetry just brought back how fascinatingly beautiful Alaska is. And if you ever get a chance to visit, you've never visited, please go. It is nothing like it. So thank you.
Thank you.
That is a ringing endorsement. That's wonderful. Any one final question? Yes, James.
How do you deal with, as you kind of mentioned a point, you know, often being these small things take up less room on the shelf, thankfully. We just get more volumes, you know. Where is the tension, or how do you resolve the tension of dealing with such a large subject and the immensity of the world around you, and then not having words for it, and then trying to find words for something that has no words in such a small space? Why is it that those topics seem to find poets, and yet John Krakauer is on the New York Times bestseller list, right? Yeah, and then I'll just.
That's a great question. So it's a mystery, is all, you know, that's the short answer. And I'm just going to explain, you know, a little bit about my process in answering it, because I do think that because poetry steps outside the boundaries of traditional prose structure, it allows you to get into spaces. What is that Leonard Cohen quote? The space where the crack where the light comes in. You know, I think it gives you a different angle of approach that way. And so, in terms of those big questions with writing, I had a professor when I was in the MFA program who said, writing is like, your writing is like a muscle. You have to exercise in order to get any good at it. You can't, if you're a runner, you can't just wake up one morning and do a marathon. You have to work up to it. So same thing with writing. And so I have a morning practice, and I write a few pages, but then I write a poem every morning. So before I thought I was even going to publish poetry, I started doing that. There's a poet by the name of William Stafford who did that every morning of his life, and I can't say the same for me, but almost every morning. He wrote a poem every morning, and it's such good practice, because poetry really requires you to condense. And so in terms of answering the big questions, it's like getting your rational mind out of the way and just letting things flow. And so just practicing and then see what comes. And then there's a lot of revision, of course, that comes after that. But a lot of the poems, it's just by writing a poem every day, and of course, 99% of those poems never saw the light of day, you know, they would just practice. Some gems come through. And it almost just feels like, you know, it just comes in because because you spend so much time just sitting in it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's wonderful. So we'll chat later, James. He's just right down the hall. But I wanted to thank you all for being here and for your wonderful attention and your very thoughtful questions. So this concludes our Visiting Writers Series events for this fall, but we will have some more in the spring. But please join us for some more literary events this fall. We're not done with literary events quite yet, including the fall chiaroscuro reading at Spears Art Gallery on Friday, October 28th. And on Monday, November 7th, our teacher education program will be welcoming children's book authors Dr. Carol Boston Weatherford and Jeffrey Boston Weatherford at the Porter Center. So stay afterwards to grab some refreshments, buy books from Highland Books to get them signed, or just to chat with us. Thank you, everyone. Have a great evening. Thanks.